But she sent me this note, or sent Tracy this note that says, have you heard the story about the time that Jim dyed his hair with henna? Well, we figured that we got to get Karen on the program. So Karen, come on up.
I have been waiting 27 years to finally see Jim Thrift in a spot where he can't say a word and has to listen to everyone else for a change. Now, it's a risky task to try and tell stories about one of the world's consummate joke and storytellers, but it's worth it to see him keep his mouth shut, if only for a few minutes. My name is Soule. My husband David and I and Jim all used to work together at American Cyanide. Now, most of you here can testify to his prowess as a lobbyist, his unequaled knowledge about the egg industry, and his skill as a salesman. So I'm not going to focus on those areas, but I will touch on his skills and abilities outside the professional world. And these are summed up in what I call the 3 B's: booze, boats, and broads. Now, Jim is from Northern California, and he fancies himself an expert on that great agricultural product emanating from Napa Valley. While he's something of a viticulture expert, he's even more knowledgeable about the end product. Of course, this knowledge is based on extensive, long-term, and hands-on research. One of my first memories of Jim is when he brought back a case of Merlot from a business trip to California. He was waiting to collect the wine from the baggage carousel when, to his horror, he saw that a bottle had broken, and his very expensive wine, probably costing him at least $2 a bottle, was leaking all over the airport. Now, not wanting to acknowledge that he was the owner of this wine, he waited until the last bag had been claimed before he surreptitiously grabbed his remaining wine bottles and scurried out of the airport. I wouldn't be surprised if he still has some of that wine in storage. 1985 was a very good year. Of course, his wine knowledge is not limited to Merlot. I seem to remember he was very fond of a certain brand of champagne called Barbari. I think that went for about $2.50 a bottle. He would buy multiple cases at a time because he was dedicated to planting and cultivating champagne corks in his neighbor's backyard in New Jersey. Now, his neighbors were a German couple. The wife used to like to sunbathe topless in the backyard around the pool, so Jim called him Fritza. Well, I'll let you figure out what he called her. Jim would stand on his back deck and pop champagne corks into the yard year after year. Now, I don't know if your dam around the crawl has a label for wine corks, but I'm confident that Jim has given them many practical field trials in Montville, New Jersey. Now, if ever a man was given the right name, it's Jim Thrift. He used to pour the cheap stuff into the empty Jack Daniels bottles and try to pass it off as the real thing. But it's pretty hard to fool a fellow boat lover, and I always knew he was just being himself, which is cheap. Now, this is the only time I'll ever refer to myself as a fellow boater, Jim, because we have had decades of debate over the superiority of sailboats versus powerboats. I've got a 38-foot sailboat to his 42-foot sea rig. And although he may have me beat on and his neighbors on the dock all wanted to borrow it to prevent their own boats from sinking. But Jim stood his ground, guarding his toy snow shovel and daring anyone to take it away. I wouldn't be surprised if he had a flare gun and was prepared to fire at any would-be thief. Now, his skill at navigating the waters of the Chesapeake, as well as the halls of Congress, is formidable, almost as good as his local knowledge of Washington's finest watering holes. When my oldest underage daughter was working an internship in D.C. this past summer, he made sure she was properly looked after. On one of her first nights in the Capitol, he took her to his favorite restaurant for dinner. I later learned from her that the ceiling was blue tarp, the walls had holes, and the rats were the size of a bloated congressional budget. But I understand the gin and tonics were just outstanding. So please, Jim, wait until she's of age before you show her where the rum and cokes are, okay? So, speaking of underage women, Jim, I understand you've perfected the art of online computer dating and have come up with some truths. First, everyone lies about their age. So, last time I checked, your age is what, 41 or so? 2, women think that living on a boat is pretty exciting. That is, until you make them pass the crew test. Can they tie a bowline knot, lasso a pilot in 20 knots of wind, and know the difference between port and starboard? But here's my truth now. Any woman who will laugh at your 20-year-old jokes, drink your booze, and secure a dock line properly is a good catch. So Jim, as you prepare to retire and ready your boat for its first journey down the intercoastal waterway, know that the industry just won't be the same without you. And when you perfect your stand-up routine and make it onto the Dave Letterman show, you'll have a new audience who can appreciate your very old jokes. So, representing your former scientific colleagues, I wish you fair winds, following seas, and a fresh audience for all the new material I'm sure you'll be developing for the next 20 years.